People are shuttling their way over, so. Good. Yeah. openly? You did? Okay. Do it to you there. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Sounds like you're having great conversations. Always happy to see that in a space where we're gathering together. We'd like to go ahead and get started, if that's good with everyone in the room. Welcome, and thank you all so much for joining us. You could be, perhaps, at Carver Hawkeye Arena. You are here. We absolutely appreciate it. I am Peter Garlock. I am a faculty member in the International Studies program, and I am the Executive Director of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council. This is ICFRC's 40th anniversary. We have been very fortunate to have been a vibrant organization for 4 decades now. We're pretty happy about that, and we're happy to celebrate with all of you today. In our first 40th anniversary event, we had the great pleasure of hearing from Ambassador Ron Mullen, who is here tonight also. In our second event, we had the great pleasure of being hosted by the wonderful Swansons, who are here in their beautiful home. In our third, most recent event, we were able to host some folks at the Lazansky Gallery, and today for our grand coming out again, celebrating in a big way. We are here in this very special place, and celebrating in part the very special relationship between the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council and the University of Iowa. In fact, a 30-year relationship, and so we are thrilled to be in this beautiful space. And by way of introduction to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council, maybe a reintroduction, I'm going to play you a short video. Together is a recognition of how far our community has come together. The unique space that ICFRC holds is that people can learn from true experts of all walks of life. Folks that are experts in university settings, folks that are experts in professional settings, folks that are experts in the lived experience. There are lots of people, especially in a community like Iowa City, that really want the opportunity to think in critical ways, that want to engage their mind and their imagination and their understanding of the world by being in a space where other people care about that too. And so the impact has been holding a space for others who care about the world. It is an inclusive place. People, regardless of background, regardless of station in life, have the opportunity to sit around with others that care about the world and to be able to talk about it. That's an incredibly important thing that we need more of. The real opportunity that ICFRC presents is that by holding space in our programs, you are almost compelled to think differently, to hold competing thoughts, to sometimes be faced with contradictions that you don't know what to do. If we don't think about the world because we're trying to get through our daily lives, then we are not really making the investment in thinking about what connects us as humans, regardless of how we live, and on the other side of the world. We need to be doing more of that so that we can tap into our humanity and the humanity of others. Well, you guys, that narrator gave me goosebumps. For that.
Our program today in this very special year of 2024 will be voting in national level elections. This number of people have never voted at this scale in human history. International exchange and engagement then is vital, and so too is ICFRC's mission, understanding international issues and fostering global engagement. Today's program, we are very excited to have two amazing speakers to talk about this very subject and the work that they do as journalists. So we're going to begin with a conversation from Frank Langfitt, during which time we hope that you will find cards and pencils or pens. If you have a question, please feel free to write those down and then hold them up. And in the discussion with Frank and Ben, we may hear from you and have your question. We won't be taking a Q&A and having a microphone. So if you do want to ask a question, find one of those cards. Frank Langfitt is NPR's Global Democracy Correspondent, a new role at NPR, and we are more than thrilled to have him here in Iowa City. Frank, is this your first time in Iowa City? Been here before. Wonderful. Campaign trail, of course, of course. And Ben Kiefer is IPR's host of River to River, a program I think many of you are probably familiar with. With that, Frank Langfitt.
Thank you very much for having me here, and congratulations on 40 years. I really love coming to these organizations because of the incredibly important role that you play in the United States. It's so important that people are informed and have a sense of the role of the US and also how affairs overseas affect every corner of the United States. And I'd also like to congratulate the Iowa Hawkeyes on an incredible season. And Caitlin Clark on becoming the highest scoring player in NCAA Division I basketball, period. Now today I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the good fortune I've had and what I've learned working overseas. I've been based in Africa, Asia, and Europe, and spent time also in Latin America, and talk a little bit about what I've learned from having the opportunity to witness history firsthand, and what I've taken away, and also how that has shaped some of the events I'm going to talk about, how it shapes the very challenging landscape that we see today for the United States, but also for democracy around the world. And I've had great opportunities, as you can see here in the upper left-hand corner, interviewing a Chinese farmer. There I'm not actually interviewing a cow in South Sudan, but just trying to get the cow to moo. I failed. This is an oyster fisherman off the coast of Cornwall who I'm discussing the impact of Brexit on his trade. And then, as you can probably guess, that's a bunker in Ukraine, talking to a soldier. I'd say one of the more recent examples where I was able to see things change dramatically was Brexit. I arrived in the United Kingdom a week before the Brexit vote, thinking I was in for a quiet posting after 5 years in Xi Jinping's China. And I woke up one morning to see, in fact, democracy had had a huge impact and had changed the course of British history. And within about 7 days, I had traveled all over from Scotland to Wales to Northern Ireland and the Irish border. And then more recently, what I found is I found that timing is really pretty much everything in foreign reporting. If you want to be there for the moment when things change, you have to sort of calculate and plan. And so as the Russian tanks began to mount on the border with Ukraine, I lobbied my editors to send me to Ukraine a couple of weeks in advance of the invasion. And it was a fascinating time because at that time, you may remember, President Zelensky was telling his people this would not happen. And as a reporter, I was there trying to explain that it was likely it would, because that's what we were hearing from the Pentagon. And I'm just going to play a little video of, this was 2 nights before the invasion. It gives you a sense of, in the heart of Kyiv, what the mood was like. This is a guy playing drums, having no idea that his country is about to change dramatically overnight. Now, talk a little bit about why this happened. President Putin, as he said, and I'm sure you've read many times, he looks at the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And he's made it very clear that he'd like to take some of those countries back and bring them back into the fold. And then after what he saw in Afghanistan with the chaotic pullout of the Americans and the anger of NATO, he saw this as a great opportunity. But what I found is several days before the invasion, I was in the heart of Kyiv in the Maidan in Independence Square, talking to people who were moralizing those who had actually helped topple the pro-Russian regime in 2014. And when you talk to them, they weren't thinking of themselves as Russians, they saw themselves as Ukrainians. And they didn't look east and north to Moscow, they looked west to London and Washington and New York. And the thing that was so striking to me is how much they valued democracy in the 3 decades that they'd had it after they had left the Soviet Union. And I wondered what people were telling Vladimir Putin in Moscow, because either they weren't telling him this, which was obvious to any reporter who was working in Kyiv at that time, or he didn't listen. One of the things we do when we try to cover a war is we spread out and try to think about the most strategic places to be. And in this case, I chose the Black Sea port of Odessa. And that's because as an economics reporter, we all knew, that if the Russian fleet could seal off the Black Sea, it could choke the economy of Ukraine and could do terrible damage. The night of the invasion, I got a call from a really good friend of mine. If you all listen a little bit to NPR, you've heard his voice for many years, Tom Bowman. He's our Pentagon correspondent. We've been buddies for 3 decades. And Tom was on the phone to me pretty much every day, telling me what to prepare for, what might be coming, and when. And he called me this night, it was the night of the 22nd, and said there'll be an assault on before dawn, and there could be an air assault that paratroopers could come in and seal off Odessa, so you better be ready to go. And then he reminded me, and I should remember this, always get your tape recorder and microphone out so that you can capture the opening of a war. And so that's what I did. And here's what it sounded like, and as I described to Rachel Martin, who was the host of Morning Edition at the time. And then jets were roaring overhead. You can hear those. And then, Rachel, just more missile strikes. Now, most people in the hotel where I was staying, some of them actually slept through this remarkably. But there's a father I ran into in the hallways. His name was Konstantin. He's a lawyer. He was trying to get his family out. And this is what he said as we stood before dawn and he was there packing his vehicle.
I'm scared. Yeah. I'm very scared. I'm scared for my baby.
Konstantin says, I'm scared for my baby. His wife was carrying a child, and I was helping them load luggage into the back of their car as they were about to head, like millions of other people, to the Polish border. One of the things that we do when we work and we cover wars like this is we travel with translators and drivers and also security people. The night before, I tried to explain to my translator, Olena, who's Ukrainian, that she needed to pack because we'd have to get going early. That morning, after the cruise missiles came in on the Black Sea and there were these explosions, I knocked on her door and I said, we've got to go. And she said, why? She had slept through the missile strikes. Also, she didn't believe any of this was going to happen. So it took me quite some time to get her and other people out and get into the vehicle and begin to make our way north. And I can remember at one point she's scrolling through Twitter and she says, there's nothing here about an invasion. And I said, Olena, we're journalists. And our job is to find out what's happening, and then we report to the people. Now, this was terribly painful for millions upon millions of Ukrainians who didn't anticipate it. They really had not wrapped their heads around it. And we have this picture of Olena just a few days before the war, and this is a number of days afterwards as we are driving towards the border, swapping out cars and trading off with other reporters. And it was very painful for our translators. And I can remember the morning after the war began, comforting them as they were weeping as we were having breakfast. Now, fascinating thing when you cover a country like that is changing, and particularly in a war, is that the country and the people change every 24 hours. And so the first day, there was almost no sign of the war other than the missiles. We didn't see any tanks. But then by the next day, you could see that people were putting up makeshift roadblocks. And then I remember that day we came upon a old Soviet cultural center, and there were all these farmers in their 50s and 60s who had come out of the fields, and they were signing up to get weapons to go to the front. And it was so striking because These were not people in good shape. They had no military background. They were simply volunteering to protect the country. And this was the commander, and I interviewed. I walked into the theater. I literally said, "Hi, I'm from National Public Radio." And he's trying to get like a militia together. And you can see from his face how terrified he is of what's happened and thinking about what the coming years could look like. In this time, we also were getting a lot of air raid sirens. In the cities where we were stopping in towns, there would be airstrikes. And we spent a lot of time in the early days in bunkers. And I'd like to just give you a little tour of what a bunker looked like back then in Ukraine.
Just tell me what.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
You may need to boost.
Central Ukraine, it's Friday night, and
Thank you.
hundreds of thousands, probably millions of Ukrainians are spending a lot of the night in places like this. This is a bomb shelter under an apartment building where we're staying here, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a tour. This is quite authentic, and what we do, it's quite a bit of a maze. When we come back here, we find we're going to see here's some people who are coming through. I guess they've
Девочки, вы там есть? Бо ми пішли.
We can keep going. These are people who are heading back to their houses. And I think if I remember the right route, it's back here. And they've set it up quite nicely. They have a little mat on the floor. Let's come around. And you can see that there are also some beds, and they have water, which they've offered us. Very nice ladies here. Nice to see you. And as I said, this is actually the second bomb shelter we've been in today. The first one was much larger. It was underneath a kindergarten. And what was so striking about it was there was one area of the bomb shelter that was sort of set aside, and there were all these little beds for kindergartners, because it was under a kindergarten, and where they could try to sleep during air raids.
And that was the image. To me, the indelible image of the first 2 days of the war is as an authoritarian nation was invading a sovereign one, that you had to put kids in a kindergarten in a basement in these little beds so they could try to get a little bit of rest. I spent a lot of time with soldiers because to me, they were the sort of the single greatest protagonists of this story as they remain. And I just want to give you a little sense of what the 2 years of war have been like and tell it through the eyes of a couple of soldiers that I got to know quite well. This is a colonel named Roman Kostenko. He's from the south, from Kherson. And he is the chair of the Defense Department in the parliament as well. And when he saw what was happening and how quickly the Russians were rolling across the south, he had a Facebook page with a lot of friends who had fought with him. They were all commandos, special forces. And he literally put together a pickup reconnaissance team. And they rushed down to Mykolaiv and fought in the suburbs of the city to push the Russians out. And so I spent a lot of time with Roman, and this for him was very personal because his village was invaded by the Russians, and the Russian army soldiers, they took over his house. And they took his body armor, they took his medals, and they lived there. And then about 8 months later, when the Ukrainians were having a great push and doing very well up in the north as well as the south, Roman was able to go in and liberate his village. And you can see Roman here. He's the one who's carrying the flag. And if you look to the right, that's his house. So the first year of war was filled with a lot of hope because the Ukrainians had sort of outperformed what people had expected. But the second year, as you know, and now it is much grimmer, it's much more difficult. And I'm going to tell a second story a little bit just about Max, the sniper that I knew, that I spent a lot of time with in the Donbass in his safe house with his reconnaissance team. And Max had told me at the time, as did others, that they thought it was going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to hold the line simply because, as you've read, the Russians outnumber them and have far more weapons. It's very, very difficult. Also, Vladimir Putin is not unafraid to lose enormous numbers of lives. And one thing that's happened that I've noticed for the 2 years that I've been in and out of Ukraine and the war is just how many people have been lost. And especially most of the best soldiers on both sides are long gone. Either they've passed away or they've been injured. And a few months ago, that's what happened to Max, is that, as you've read, lots of landmines have been laid by the Russians to stop a Ukrainian advance. And Max stepped on one. And there you can see him in his hospital bed. And we chatted a little bit after that happened. I'm going to switch gears now and talk a little bit in terms of the kind of history that I've had a chance to cover. Sometimes there's history, things you find that you never knew had happened, that it was just going on far away that nobody was really aware of. And I'm going to tell this as just a little lighter note, because this, when we talk about international affairs these days, it is very serious. But as my wife, who's a veterinarian, always tells me about stories, Frank, kids and animals. So I'm going to talk a little bit about elephants. When I was based in Nairobi, the belief had been for many, many years that during the Sudanese civil war, rebels had wiped out almost all of the wildlife, that they'd eaten it in the bush. And then one day, conservationists were flying around South Sudan, and they saw these elephants, and they had no idea where they'd come from because they thought they'd all perished. In fact, 5,000 elephants had hid out in a swamp called the Sud. And it wasn't just elephants, it was antelopes. It was more than 1 million antelope running across the plains. And I took this from a helicopter as we were out, because we were spending time, I was with conservationists trying to tag the elephants so they could follow the migration patterns and continue to protect them from the rebels. So one group was in a spotter plane that would find the elephants. And then I was in the helicopter most of the time with this veterinarian with a dart gun. You would dart the elephant, you jump out, rush over, try to get the collar around the elephant, and then get back in the helicopter before the herd showed up again, because the herd would be very unhappy. And there were times where the herd would get back and it would charge people and it would destroy helicopters. It was pretty dangerous stuff. So I remember getting out at this very time with this elephant, and I was looking in the bush and doing these 360s because I heard this. I don't know if you can hear that. It sounds like growling. And so I thought, the elephants are coming. And then I realized it was the elephant. He was just snoring.
Uh-oh. She wants to wake up. You know what we do if she wakes up? You run.
You run. That was my instruction. If she begins to move, you head for the helicopter, and up we go. When I think about history too, I've been talking a little bit about these histories that think the world changes in a moment. It's an election in London and the United Kingdom. It's tanks rolling into Ukraine, starting the greatest war since World War II, the biggest one on the continent. And then there's another story that I began covering in the 1990s, and that's really the rise of China and the economy. And how many people have been to Shanghai? I'm just curious. Well, then you're familiar with this. So the first image is 1987. The second one, this is Pudong. And this is 2014. And this is what it looks like today. And my wife and I and our children, we used to live just upstream from these buildings. And when I returned to China, I was there first for 5 years in the 90s, then returned in 2011. And I wanted to try to capture this rise, what was happening, but tell it through the eyes and experiences of ordinary Chinese. Now, when I got out of college, I could not get a job in journalism. I sent out 100 resumes, nobody would hire me. So I became a taxi driver in Philadelphia. And I drove around and found it was a great way to learn how to interview all kinds of different people who would take you to all different parts of the city. And so when I returned to Shanghai, I thought maybe what I'll do is I'm going to set up a free taxi cab. I'll drive around, see if people get into it, talk about stories, find out what they're interested in. And sure enough, it worked. And so I began driving people over a period of a couple of years around town, and the most interesting characters, I would get to know them well, and I would do stories on Morning Edition and All Things Considered. But then I went outside of China, outside of Shanghai, because it is a big country, and my favorite trip was a Chinese New Year road trip, where I took these three people back home to the countryside. And this is the largest mass migration in the world. It's hundreds of millions of people going from the cities back home to the countryside. And it's a great way to tell the story of China, because when I first got there in the 90s, it was a rural country. And by the time I got back, it was an urban nation. And to the left here is Rocky. He's a lawyer who works in Shanghai. That's his fiance, Xiao Piao. And then to the right is Charles. He works in a factory in Shanghai. So we drove 500 miles back to their villages, and both of them were getting married. So I ended up becoming the wedding photographer and the wedding chauffeur. And it was great fun because I had that van that you saw, and driving to Rocky and Xiao Piao's wedding, I was stopping at villages along the way, and villagers were getting in, and some of these villagers had never seen a foreigner before. And they would look at me and do a double take. And Rocky would say, "Oh, that's Frank. He's a friend of ours from Shanghai." And they'd say, "Oh, okay, off we'll go." And it's wonderful as a reporter to have a chance sometimes to just see traditions play out in different places, because I think you really get to understand a country and people and culture and values. And so I remember driving into the village with the guests, and as the couple showed up, they were greeted by this band wearing People's Liberation Army uniforms. And of course, no wedding would be complete in rural China without lots of fireworks. And the entertainment, as always, the dancing aunties. And what I liked about this story is, in a sense, it wasn't unusual at all. It was quite typical. Rocky was probably 33 years old, and he had grown up playing with frogs and planting peanuts in this little village. And then within about 10, 15 years, he was working in the skyscraper in Shanghai as a lawyer. The kind of thing that would happen, take 2 or 3 generations in this country, had happened to one person. And this was a story that was told millions upon millions of times in China, and it was a very positive story. Now, I ended up collecting a lot of these stories and then following a select group of characters for 4 years in their lives. Many of them moved around the world, and I visited them in London and Paris and Michigan and Santa Monica, and wrote a book on these very critical years. These were the Xi Jinping years, and how they sort of saw themselves and how they saw their country changing. I'm going to wrap up with my first assignment overseas back in 1997, which has a lot to do with democracy. And this is the Hong Kong handover, when the United Kingdom gave Hong Kong back to China. And at that time, we and many were very concerned that the Chinese Communist Party would not respect the democratic system, the semi-democratic system, and the free speech and free press that people in Hong Kong enjoyed. And for the first 14 years, it worked. 17 years actually worked out pretty well. There was a lot of freedom, and then China began to meddle and break its word. And they decided that they wanted to make sure who the people of Hong Kong could choose as their leader. And Hong Kong people, who were seen widely as only being interested in money, it turned out that in all their time and freedom, they really liked democracy, and they shocked a lot of people in East Asia as they came out and they protested and came out in the streets. And this is one of the tent camps during that period. And for my kids, we were living in Shanghai at the time, and I thought, there is no classroom where I could teach them this kind of lesson about what freedom means, what people are willing to fight for when it's threatened. And so I called my wife and I said, "Bring Katie and Chris down. We need to spend a night in the protest camp." And so,
bring them here.
Excuse me. And so I gave Katie a microphone and a recorder, and she went out to interview people. And we ended up actually putting this together as a story for Morning Edition. And Katie met a woman named Kelly Chan, and she brought her kids there because she wanted them to witness this history in case anybody tried to tell them that it never had happened. And this is how Kelly put it.
I bring them here to witness, and I hope when they grow up and they won't forget what really happened in here, and they can't erase history.
Chan told her son the protest, which has blocked roads for more than 2 months, is illegal.
One day probably I will go to jail, and I hope you understand, by going to jail doesn't mean I make any crime. I'm just fighting for democracy. I'm fighting for us. I'm fighting for you.
And I think in this year, as Peter put it, with so many elections and so many people going to the polls, and authoritarianism continuing to be in a very strong position, it's worth really thinking about what this woman in this protest camp 10 years ago was saying in Hong Kong, because I think it resonates here in the United States and around the world today. So thank you very much for having me, and I'm looking forward to chatting with Ben and taking any questions.
Okay, yes, if you do have a question, there are note cards, and there are pens and pencils around. If you don't have one in front of you and you do want to ask a question, just tap your neighbor on the shoulder and get one of those cards over to you. Gentlemen?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you all for being here, and thanks for this invitation to share the stage with you, Frank. We had a brief conversation earlier today, and a couple weeks ago, you were on my show, and if you'd like to listen to that podcast, there'll be some overlap, but go to river at IPR.org. What I want to ask you, first of all, about, and please do hand those questions forward, hand up your cards, and we'll get someone to collect those. So we have a good exchange here of ideas. With all your coverage, how many years have you spent abroad doing your work? Do you know a total?
About close to 20.
20 years
Yeah.
in how many different countries?
Over 50.
Over 50 countries. And when did you return more or less to the US, not just for a vacation or a brief stint?
I came back last year.
Okay, last year.
Yes.
Okay. After being in Africa and Beijing a couple of times, in Britain during Brexit and so forth, and covering the outbreak of the Ukraine war. I'm interested in all your coverage of democracy abroad, what you noticed returning to the US that had changed, that is relevant to our democracy, because we are very concerned about it.
Yeah, I noticed a huge change. I mean, to put this in some context, I left during the first Obama administration. Let me tell you, it's you know, because you've been living it, but it's really a huge change from what I'd experienced. And there are a couple of things that come to mind. I've moved into a neighborhood we were talking about this today. I moved into a neighborhood in Annapolis. It's near the Chesapeake Bay. It's way outside the Beltway. And so there's a lot of diversity, in political diversity in the neighborhood. And I was inviting people over for Christmas cocktails, and I invited some friends of ours across the street who were retirees from the NSA, who were Democrats, and they weren't going to necessarily come because they saw on the list that we'd invited other neighbors down the street who I was told had been at the Capitol on January 6th. They didn't go into the Capitol, so that's a plus, I suppose, but they come to the Capitol. So that's one thing. A second thing I'd like to point out, because the one thing I found so helpful as a foreign correspondent is the sort of comparative politics. You live in a place in some ways similar to the United States, but you see the differences. The United Kingdom is really, really interesting. I spent a lot of time covering Boris Johnson, who kept me very, very busy. And one of the things that was fascinating is there was a consensus in the United Kingdom among the Labour and certainly among the Conservatives that Boris was a habitual liar and that he really didn't have any strong values. Boris was about Boris. And so when he got into this Partygate scandal that you may remember, that during COVID, he was violating his own rules, and they were throwing parties in number 10 Downing Street. The whole country said it was time for him to go. And the people put such pressure on the parliamentarians that Conservative MPs said, you got to go. And out he went. There was no difference. Everybody agreed on the facts. And what I found so interesting in the United States and so different was that's not the case here at all, as you well know, because you've been living here for a long time. And while the media is polarized in the United Kingdom, there is a general consensus. And there is a consensus also generally on values, about democracy, about free speech, about fact-based reporting. And so it was fascinating to see how January 6th and the election of 2020 played out here, which is very, very different. I did a story on NPR about this very thing. So that's another difference that I really noticed.
Right, and we saw after January 6th, some leaders voiced concerns, had one stance in the days after, and then in the weeks after, completely flip-flopped there because they hadn't, I guess, wet their finger and put it to the wind and didn't quite get, they thought we were at a turning point, but we weren't. So what was the difference there? What made the difference?
Do you mean in the United States or in the UK?
United States?
In the United States, I didn't cover it, but I mean, I think from what I saw, and you would know better than I, is people made a political calculation. I think a lot of people in Congress, I'm sure, know who won the 2020 election. I mean, what I found so interesting in the United Kingdom is because people of both political persuasions believed in the same sets of facts, and that even the Daily Mail, they didn't side with Boris. They knew who he was. And so it was that pressure from the public that gave no choice to the conservative MPs. If they wanted to keep their job, they had to get rid of Boris. And that was democracy and fact-based reporting working.
So what do you do coming back to the United States after the vast experience you've had in over 50 countries? You come into the US where you have different narratives, very hardened narratives, and it's been called a post-factual world that we live in. But you as a journalist depend on facts.
Yes.
We believe in a system that facts inform an electorate, and an electorate will make good decisions as to who their leaders are. What do you do with a system that is broken in the way our system is, where, and like me, I think perhaps you have this sense sometimes, or the thought, how much good am I doing here? Because it seems like a lot of people are not paying attention to fact-based, data-based, science-based reporting.
I mean, you've asked sort of fundamental question that is a challenge to this democracy, or any democracy where you have alternative realities of facts. It's very challenging for us. All we can do is be fair and report the facts as best we can. I don't think that anybody that I've seen in my profession has figured out how you handle this. It's a huge challenge. And if people can figure out, and I think the only path back for a democracy is if you can figure this out. We talk about it all the time. We're dealing a lot with AI already. One of my colleagues that I work with on investigations, she just did a piece last week, and I sat down with her a couple weeks ago, and she said, Frank, I want you to listen to these clips of my voice and try to guess which is me and which is AI. And I couldn't figure it out. And 6 months ago, it would have been easy, but that's how fast it's changing. I'm also working on a story that hasn't come out yet, and it deals with an enormous amount of disinformation. And it's taken me a long time to sort this out. And I can understand why people didn't solve this problem. Other journalists weren't able to kind of get through it. And I thought, if the people that I'm dealing with, the people, the protagonists of the story, had access and skills in AI, it might be impossible to actually get that story done. So it is a huge challenge. I don't have an answer for you yet, but a lot of it is also being out there, interacting, writing lots of stories, and trying to figure out as you go along what might possibly work. If anybody has any ideas here, I would be all ears.
Let's go to some questions from you. This person wants to know, what's the most important variable of democracy in your opinion?
That's a great question. I would almost say, to go back at this point, if you look at different countries, I would think it is a shared sense of reality and belief in fact-based reporting. And this is sort of fundamental to American civics. It's fundamental to why all of you are here, because you care. You want to be well informed. You want to be engaged voters. Not enough people in the United States are like that. I've been very struck at kind of the lack of civics that's been revealed by some of the events of this country. I thought there was a lot more of that being taught, apparently not. But I would say a shared reality and a shared agreement on facts is fundamental.
Mm-hmm. A number of people have written on the card, very top of mind here in our news environment, of course, the situation in Gaza, in addition to what's happening in Ukraine. And so what a number of people are pointing out is, here perhaps this is one that puts it in one. How can NPR square its gratuitous coverage of Putin's invasion and land theft in Ukraine against the microcosm of news addressing Israel's lawless theft of land in Palestine? So someone with an obvious opinion about the coverage there that NPR has.
Yeah, I welcome the question. So I was in Israel for 3 weeks, and I was in the West Bank. And as you know, unfortunately, none of us can report in Gaza. We can't get in. We would all love to go to Gaza, even as dangerous as it is. I've never covered a war where I couldn't actually go out with soldiers. So it's very difficult. However, we have a producer in Gaza named Anas Baba, and he's one of the last producers for any Western news organization in Gaza. And he travels around Gaza. He sleeps in houses sometimes full of 100 people, 120 people sharing a single toilet. There are days he has no food, and he is constantly working with our correspondents outside in Israel and elsewhere to tell us what's going on, and finding sources and talking to people and helping with interviews and feeding us information and sending us tape. There have been days where I was with Daniel Estrin, who has done an absolutely superb job in what has to be one of the most difficult foreign postings in the world. And he would be out of touch with Anas for 10 hours. And Anas would be in places that were very dangerous. And Daniel was terrified he was dead. And I would be having lunch with Daniel, and he's like, I haven't heard from Anas. So the coverage is imperfect because we can't get access, and we can't get access because of the Israeli government. But we have people risking their lives, as we all have, to get at the story. And I've heard the stories. I've been there. I've worked with my colleagues. They're doing as much as humanly possible to keep the story of Gaza on the air. And they've done a very good job in what is an extremely difficult and frustrating, for journalists, frustrating situation where you can't go yourself.
What is your understanding? Perhaps you can give us some sort of behind the scenes of the editorial decisions made at NPR. How much, when a story is decided to do the story that is, talking about the plight of the Palestinian people, and then the other side, the hostages that remain in the Israeli side and the families in distress about that. How is that balance decided upon? What types of things are discussed?
I am not in those meetings. I'm not an editor. I'm a reporter. In the mornings, we would talk about them, and where we were in Tel Aviv, and talk about, what are the new things that we can say? We're in the news business. What are the new stories that we can tell? We would frequently go to the square where the families of the hostages were to see what was going on there. While we could not get into Gaza, we would spend as much time as possible in the West Bank. The West Bank is an incredible story. It's a powder keg. And there's been a lot of violence in the West Bank. The UN has, since the beginning of the war, if I remember correctly, over 300 people dead, mostly shot by Israeli soldiers and settlers. We reported all of this. When I was in Gaza, I was in Ramallah, and I was walking down a street doing the story on the economy and how the fact that Israel will not let workers come across. And this is a third of the GDP of the West Bank. They rely on the Israeli economy. And I was just talking to people. It's pretty easy. And I came across a man who said, yes, I'm actually from Gaza, and I haven't been able to go over, and I'm sleeping in a gymnasium. And then he said, and by the way, 78 members of my family were killed by an Israeli drone strike in our apartment building in Gaza City 10 days ago. And my son's under the rubble, and my other son has buried them all. And so we report that. And when the number hit the horrifying, and every number is horrifying, 20,000, I led my story with that. And I mean, I just randomly talked to a guy on a street. That's how common this is. The numbers are obviously real.
Away from Gaza, with this question from one of our audience members. With the increasing isolationist view within the U.S., this person writes, I'm interested in knowing how people in the world today think of the USA, especially as a champion for democracy.
Well, it would depend on where you go, but the United States, as you might imagine, doesn't have the reputation it had 25 years ago. When I first went to China in 1997, this country was at peace, and it was running budget surpluses, and it was kind of the envy of a lot of people in China. And people in China would say to me, how do you guys do it? I mean, you just keep, and of course, things have changed a lot since then. The war in Iraq, the global financial crisis, attitudes have really changed. And I think that COVID There was a lot of criticism in the global South that the global North hoarded COVID vaccines. And obviously, Gaza is another good example, where you've seen certainly the Democratic Party and elsewhere attitudes towards the United States really hardening. So I do not think that the United States is the kind of example of democracy that it would have been seen, a quarter century ago.
How much damage to our reputation did the war in Iraq?
Tremendous. So I'll give you an example. So 90s Beijing, you're an American for the most part. People think, great, wow, good for you. You're an American. I fly back. I'm gone for 10 years. I fly back 2011, arrive. I'm in Shanghai. I'm in a cab chatting in Mandarin in the taxi. And one of the first things the cabbie says is, why do Americans love war? Why do you go to war with all these countries? And he's talking about Afghanistan and Iraq. And I say, well, Afghanistan, the United States had every right to at least initially do something about that because the United States was attacked. But Iraq, I certainly had no answer for. And so that's a great example of, in just really about 10 years, how dramatically opinion in China had changed towards the United States.
This questioner asks, is the U.S. partial retreat from supporting Ukraine? That hangs in the balance in Congress, but
Sure.
It's been a struggle for weeks. How is that seen in Europe as similar to the U.S.'s position in the 1930s? America first, avoiding involvement in Europe in World War II. Is Europe threatened or galvanized by this?
Both. That's a really good question. So the Europeans have always known that the Americans want them to spend more, and the Americans are right. The Europeans, without the United States, obviously by far the largest military in NATO, there isn't the protection, especially for the eastern flank of NATO. And so the Europeans know they need to pay more, and they have been paying more. The difficulty is if the United States were to pull back, there's no way the Europeans can fill the gap. There have been a lot of discussions, and I think they're being accelerated, of the Europeans in NATO playing a much bigger role. Also in part, and this is a really interesting part of the geopolitics, the United States is by far most interested in China. It sees there's a consensus, as you know, on both sides of the aisle that the greatest single challenge in terms of a nation state is China. But the attempts to pivot to China have taken a very long time because more urgent things have come up, particularly in the Middle East. And so every time the United States tries to pivot to China, and it's done much more there, it's really shored up its alliances with Japan and Korea, and then you've seen the sub deal with Australia. So they've made progress there. But the United States can only do so much these days. And so there's a lot of conversations from the Americans to the Europeans that they are going to have to do more to look after security in their region. And I think that's where it's headed, kind of no matter what.
Mm-hmm. What is the real threat to China in the South Pacific? What is the U.S. most worried about, and what do you believe China seeks as a goal?
So the United States, I think, is very concerned. The United States Navy has underwritten peace and security really since 1945, and it has created opportunities for unfettered free trade. And as they look at the South China Sea, they are very concerned about what China has now as a blue water navy as to how it will behave. And I'm sure you're all familiar, if you've seen the maps, the Chinese claim the entire South China Sea, the 9-dash line, as their own, which of course are mostly international waters. It's not true at all. And when I first started covering China, they had little piers, little docks on these reefs that they would say, this is Mischief Reef and this is our territory. And at the time it looked silly, but of course they were able to build islands with airstrips and missile batteries. And they now, the feeling I have is they have de facto control of the South China Sea. And they've been wanting to push the US Navy out past the first island chain, and they want to have that control. I think the concern of the United States is if an authoritarian country like China has that maritime control, they then have a lot of leverage over other democracies and allies in the region. Why does Asia matter? I mean, these are the biggest economies other than the US. You're looking at Japan, you're looking at India, you're looking at South Korea. These are very, very important engines. A thing I didn't get to in the in the program, because I just didn't want to run too long, is of course from after taking back Hong Kong, from Xi Jinping's perspective, and this he shares a little bit with Putin, is he's all about restoring what was lost during the Civil War and also what was lost during colonial times. He's taken back Hong Kong, and now what he wants to do is to take back Taiwan. And within a number of years, there's a thought that the Navy in China will have at least the military capability to do so. That's the next big thing. Doesn't mean they're going to do it. It's very risky. The Chinese military hasn't fought a war since 1979 in Vietnam, and they didn't do well. And I'm sure that he's seen what has happened to the Russians in Ukraine. It's a very cautionary tale, but that's the next place I think we're all watching.
This questioner writes, I'm sure you have lived in many countries that were experiencing democratic backsliding. Are there anywhere there's a downward trajectory reversed unexpectedly and did not progress as you were expecting?
Do you mean there was democratic backsliding and then
It's on a card. I don't know.
it's on a
what
card,
that meant.
right?
Yeah.
Because it's not your question. So I think that question is asking if I've seen a reversal of democratic backsliding, and the answer would be Poland most recently. I mean, the attacks on the judiciary, and now you have Donald Tusk is in charge. And a lot of that, my colleague Rob Schmitz, who's based in Berlin, has covered it very well. A lot of that was a government that was so corrupt that it fell. You know, it just became so unpopular, and they were toppled. Things can be reversed, but what we're seeing in Poland is a lot of damage is done, and undoing that damage is difficult. Another place that I wouldn't say this is backsliding because it didn't get that far, but what I found so fascinating when I was in Israel was to see how galvanizing the attempted judicial reform, which many people saw as a way of actually just breaking the judiciary so that there would be no check and balance on executive and Knesset power, how that brought hundreds of thousands of people out into the streets. I talked to people who were organizers, and they were shocked that something as unsexy as judicial reform would bring people out. But what else was fascinating is there were military people who felt that this was very important because they thought, how can we, if we don't have democratic integrity, how can we know the sorts of orders that we get in the battlefield are things that really we can trust? So they got very involved, reservists, and then they helped after October 7th, when the government was slow to help. They rushed down and rescued people, and they got very, very involved. And now they have created a party, and they will be running in the next elections, whenever that is. So it's a fascinating story about how the judicial reform movement actually ended up really inspiring people and creating political opposition, which I'm sure was the last thing that the people who were, trying to make these changes to the judiciary had in mind.
Next question. What is the Sudanese perception of the lack of international intervention, especially regarding the U.S. role or lack thereof?
It's a great question. I don't make the policy, but you will hear in lots of places around the world. I lived and worked in Africa, and you will hear in certain parts of the world that the United States takes great interest in certain areas and does not take, for various reasons, including what it sees as strategic reasons, not taking an interest. And that's also where people, they sometimes, they see double standards. And that does also hurt the United States reputation. I will say one thing for the US in terms of democracy in Ukraine, because I covered the lead up and then the beginning, is the US did do a very good job of rallying the EU. And one thing that it did that was very smart is it never did this before. It put its intelligence out there and said, there are all these tanks. We know he's coming. And that actually motivated the EU and NATO nations to begin to figure out how they were going to get all the weapons into Ukraine. And that was very, very important. And it did show it did well in sort of the leadership role it showed at the time.
I'd like you to share a little anecdote that you shared earlier in the day around lunchtime when you covered the beginning of the Ukraine war. And, war is chaos, but you experienced that firsthand, and it ties in with what you just said, that Zelensky, many Ukrainians did not believe the intelligence that the U.S. was sharing with Ukraine, and their armed forces on that first day.
Yeah.
Tell that story, because it really gives, I don't know if you want to call it the fog of war, or just a sense of what those first days were like, because here in the US, we watched, we listened, we heard reporting, your reporting, and many others. But the story you told was really terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the two soldiers that I interviewed.
And the rocket launcher.
Sure. So war is just chaos. And what's interesting is when you talk to some people, they want to kind of present it in a very heroic image. But the fact of the matter is the early days of the war in Ukraine were very chaotic. I can tell you, I did not see a military vehicle until the night before the invasion on any streets in Ukraine. That's how unprepared they were. And I just was shaking my head driving to Odessa. About a month or two into the war, I ended up interviewing some soldiers who were reservists, and they'd been in the reserve since 2014, since the Russian invasion of the Donbass. And they told me what their first 48 hours were like. And when the invasion happened, what a lot of people did is they just called their units and said, what do we do? And they said, come down here and get some weapons. I mean, they really were not prepared. And so these two soldiers came down and they were handed NLAWs, these British anti-tank missiles that you would remember early on in the war. And they said, we need you to take these out to some soldiers out on a highway. And there's a Russian phalanx of tanks coming down, and give them to them and they'll take out the tanks. So the guys go and so they get up there and they can't find the guys they're supposed to deliver the missiles to. And they get another call from the commander and he says, okay, they're not around. You need to fire the missiles at the tanks. And they say, we've never even handled these missiles. And the commander says, YouTube it. So they open up YouTube on their phone, how to fire an NLAW, and they're looking at it. And, you know, the tanks are making their way down the highway and they're trying to figure it out. Unfortunately, it's not that complicated. And so they go, okay, and they're in a forest, so they're trying to get some cover, and the tanks are coming, and they get it up on their shoulder, and they're looking down, and then they get another call from the commander who says, oh, no, don't fire, it's our guys. And the line from one of the soldiers I talked to at the time, he said, we were completely chaotic, but the Russians were much more chaotic. And that's why the early days of the war, things went the way they did.
Amazing. This person, I think, would like you to comment on what you touched on in your presentation here, the huge change that you saw in China in your two different times that you were there. This person writes, I went to China in 1988 to help with the first cochlear implant, and then traffic jams everywhere with bicycles, no car, all buildings 2 stories, blocked toilets, no running water. Talk about this, because I mean, it's something, I guess, in our country, people alive here have not perhaps experienced that rapid of a transformation from rural to urban.
That's a great description. And I think my experience in China was breathtaking, because as journalists, we were seeing something that had never happened in human history. A country of this size changing so quickly and the economy rising so fast had simply never happened. When I got there, it was 1.2 billion people. And the growth rates were 9, 10, 11%. I mean, got up to, one year they got up to 14%. And when I got there, I don't know, how many people have been to Beijing? Great. So you know the Avenue of Eternal Peace, you're looking down towards Tiananmen Square. And in the 80s, or 90s rather, you just had some tall buildings along the edge, and then for all beyond that, it was just 1-story gray brick alleyways and little courtyard houses. And I would go away for a month to cover a story in Indonesia, and my wife would be, you know, she'd been doing work on it. She had a Beijing Jeep that she drove. And I remember one day she said, well, let's go back. I want to get a tape deck for the Jeep. So we went back to this whole block that was all just auto shops. And we turned the corner and there was nothing there. It had all been leveled in 2 weeks. There were times I would come back from 3 weeks in Vietnam and I would see 10-story buildings. Like, where did that come from? This was normal. When I returned in 2011, 2012, I would go to parts of Beijing, and I drove a car in Beijing, so I was all over the city. places I had been, I recognized nothing. I went to Tianjin. It's a port city to the east of Beijing. I honestly, drove around the city and I said, I've never been to this city. It was just extraordinary. And in many ways, I mean, it was transforming people's lives. The infrastructure was remarkable. And it was, you know, I had friends who, when I first met them, had little apartments that were part of their work units. And 5 years later, when I was leaving, they owned a duplex and a second home. And on the way back to the States, we met them in Paris. It was nothing like that, even 5 years earlier.
Frank, sadly, our time is coming to
Okay.
an end, but I'd like to ask you this question from our audience, and then a follow-up too. What advice would you give young people interested in journalism? News journalism has changed so much in your lifetime.
That's not an easy one. I was very, very fortunate to start off actually in local news. I covered county council board meetings, I covered zoning boards, and I learned the very basics by covering local government, which of course comes back to the idea of how important it is local democracy and an informed electorate. Most of those jobs are gone now. One thing I see where there's some hope is both philanthropists are trying to fund new independent news organizations. The Baltimore Banner is a good example. I returned home last year and I got to Annapolis and I couldn't find out what was going on in Annapolis because there was no real newspaper who was covering it closely. But I started subscribing to the Banner, where a lot of former reporters from the Baltimore Sun, colleagues of mine, are working, and there's a lot of great coverage. And so there are people still trying to develop these philanthropic models. There's an American Journalism Project that has raised over $150 million to help companies develop, especially some of these nonprofits, develop business models and develop revenue streams. I mean, there's certainly a demand for it. The challenge, no doubt, is financial. But there are a lot of new startups. I would say look at those, and less towards legacy, and really look at some of the new news organizations.
And the last question, Frank, imagine I'm a genie and I can turn back your biological clock. I can shave a few decades off your age. And then I get to ask, what color, before the beautiful silver hair you have right now, what color was your hair?
Dirty blonde.
Dirty blonde, okay. So what I'm getting at is you get to go back a few decades in your biological clock. Would you choose to be a journalist as a young man in the year 2024?
It would be a tough one.
What would you be weighing?
What would I be weighing? Financial sustainability. I mean, that would be the biggest single concern, because we don't see business models. And what's a real concern, coming back to the whole theme of today, which is an informed electorate and democracy, is I don't know how you have an informed electorate if you don't have reliable and extensive fact-based reporting. And that's why it's so important to support good journalism.
Frank Langfitt, thank you very much for this conversation.
Ladies and gentlemen, what a fantastic conversation. On behalf of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council, we are grateful that you came out this evening to celebrate our 40th anniversary with us and to listen to these two amazing gentlemen talk about the importance of democracy and journalism. Please, one more round of applause for them. As a final note, I hope that you will consider making a gift to the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council. I encourage you to grab one of our impact reports on the way out. And as a final note, I would say, as you've heard today, democracy is on the ballot this year. Get engaged, stay engaged, please vote. Thank you all very much for coming tonight, and we are adjourned. Thank you, Ben. Thank you. Absolutely. Will do. I appreciate that. let's take a few minutes.